Welcome to the Political Life of Poetry, the second in the Clough series on the arts and the culture of democracy. Thanks to the generosity of Chuck Clough and the inspired leadership of Clough Director of Life Review, we have the opportunity to reflect on a relationship that is so essential it's in danger of becoming invisible to the eye, between the political life of a nation and its poetry. In order for you to hear as little from me as possible and as much from these poets before you, Van Boland, Ed Hirsch, Kevin Young, we have extensive bios and notes in your program. If you need one right now, if you want to raise your hand, you probably want them to you. You're preset. All right. Suffice it to say that each is a powerful voice and a great friend of poetry. Poetry I know many of you have reached to for light, both personal and political, in dark times. On the Scottish Parliament building, there's a line of poetry attributed to Alistair Gray, a Scottish poet and author, and in turn an elaboration of a line by Canadian poet Dennis Lee in his 1972 Civil Elegies. The poetry on the Parliament building reads, "Work as if you lived in the early days of a better nation." We engage in this conversation in this spirit. I'm delighted to welcome these magnificent poets to Boston College.
Thank you, Kim. We're really glad to be with you. I'm glad to be here with my friends, Van Boland and Kevin Young, to talk about political life and poetry. It will be just like political life. At first, we'll be very polite, but at the end, it will probably descend badly. So the first thing I would like to say to you is that I just would like to remind you that in every authoritarian society in the world, the writing of poetry and the publishing of poetry is extremely dangerous. And it's dangerous and considered threatening to the state, not just when poets write dissident poems, which are obviously threatening to the state, poems of protest in direct opposition to the state. But even when poets write about their private and interior lives, that's considered threatening to the social concerns of the state. And unless poets are willing to put their pens and their voices to the work of the party, they are considered dangerous. And the reason I bring this up is that it seems to me that the first thing I'd like to say in considering this subject is that the freedom of poets to write about whatever they want is the most important thing. And that we should never be prescriptive about asking our poets to write in a certain way. And that one of the things that poetry does, which is bring forth our interior lives, is dangerous to the state and always considered so. Emerson defined a bard as one who is free and who makes free. And so the freedom of the poet to speak about whatever he or she wants and to engage socially however he or she wants is crucial. And that poems that at one time might not seem political in terms of events at a given time may eventually come to seem political. For example, in 1862, Emily Dickinson was writing some of her greatest poems, and she was using the Civil War as a metaphor for self-division. And she was sending these poems, by the way, to Higginson, who was commanding a troop of Union soldiers against the Confederacy. Who knows exactly what he made of them. But you would have said in the 1860s, one would have said that Whittier's anti-slavery poems or Melville's great Civil War poems were political poems, and that Emily Dickinson's poems seemed private. But a later generation would look at Emily Dickinson's poems and say, these poems challenge the patriarchy in ways that are extremely political, that we now think of as forging a crucial voice and political ground for the lyric against certain male values. And those poems ended up being political. And no one could imagine that American poetry would have been richer if Emily Dickinson had written differently and addressed the Civil War in a different kind of way than she did. So this is important because it means that how we think about poetry and social life and political life and social engagement has a long and complicated history, and poets enter into it in different ways. The Lamentations of Jeremiah is a political poem. For me, the first thing that I'd like to say to you in our conversation is that the poet wants justice and the poet wants art, and that in poetry you can't have one without the other. There has to be a reason that poems of social engagement are poems rather than political tracts. And there's no getting around the fact that for them to be poems, art must enter into it. So I brought you a little quote from Robert Frost about Jeremiah. Jeremiah, it seems, had a sincerity question because the anguish of his lamentations was tameable to the form of 22 stanzas for the 22 letters of the alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet has been kept to the 22 letters it came out of Egypt with, so the number 22 means as much form as ever. So the message is delivered formally in terms of how the poet brings his or her experience to the quest for justice. That being said, poets have always entered into the fray. They've always taken sides. From my perspective, they haven't always taken the right side or the correct side. They've been all different sides of an issue. It's easy to think at this particular moment in time that poets are all engaged from the leftist side, but it wasn't so long ago the great modernists were writing that they were almost all sympathetic to fascism, and they were entering in politically with an extremely aggressive ways. That one of the most avant-garde movements of the 20th century, futurism, was very allied with fascism, and that it had a powerful politics. So, but nonetheless, poetry wants to be part, needs to be part of a connection to society. And the poet writes as a prophet, as a citizen, as a person engaged in social life in terms of refining the language. And we can find, I think, the three of us, but also the poets we love, there's a tremendous spectrum of poets that we love who seem to be very apolitical, and poets who are tremendously political all the way, like Neruda or Nazım Hikmet, the great Turkish poet, those who saw themselves as part of a struggle. But nonetheless, there are ways consciously and unconsciously that poems have political implications, and that even the most apolitically seeming poets are engaged in political ways that they may not think of it themselves. I'll give you one more example of a poet who seemed completely apolitical, James Barrow, who made a big deal out of never reading the newspapers and never engaging social events. And if we were thinking about, say, Kenneth Rexroth, an extremely political poet, versus Merrill, you'd say Merrill was a completely apolitical poet. And yet, the way that Merrill ended up writing about gay life has been a kind of forerunner for the way a lot of people think about gay experience. And we now see that those poems, those openly homoerotic poems, have great consequences for social issues in society. And Merrill, I'd say, helped move the line a little bit on that. And so these poems that seemingly were apolitical turned out to be political. That's one side. The other would be Pablo Neruda, who inside of a great, tremendous poem, Canti Honoral, is writing 2 odes to Stalin. And he saw that there was no gap. He felt there was no gap between the quest for social justice and the work of his art. These are sort of the issues I'd like to lay out a little bit as I turn it over to my friends.
Well, let me begin taking up something Eddie said with a small story that has always stayed with me about the political engagement of the poet. W.H. Auden, like a lot of people, went out to Spain and joined the cause against Franco. And, he didn't join the party. A lot of people at the time, Spender joined the party. I think Day Lewis joined it very briefly. He didn't actually join the party, but he was, of course, with the party, and the party was, the Communist Party and Marxism were a great presence in that struggle. It was about 37, 38. I heard this story told by Spender, and I think it's an extremely important story. He wrote a pamphlet that he suppressed. He suppressed it later for many years. The pamphlet is called Spain. And, you know, it's tomorrow. It's a long incantation of the hopes for tomorrow. But it ends with 3 or 4 lines, and it said, "History to the defeated may say alas, but cannot help or pardon." So history to the defeated may say alas. This is an absolutely mainstream sense of the Marxist agenda at the time, which was that history had an ongoing momentum, and it was not right to stop in any way, but to let that momentum go forward. W.H. Auden left London, England in '39 and was criticized for it. Before he went, he visited Stephen Spender. And Spender had Spender said this in a radio interview. He had the pamphlet, it was a chapbook really, up on his mantelpiece, and Spain. And Auden walked over to the pamphlet and opened it, and Spender has that copy, and looked at the last lines and crossed them out with his pen, and he wrote in the margin, "This is a lie." And every political poet fears having to do that. Whatever political poet, whatever that engagement, the fear is that you will step out of your truth into an engagement. Now, I come from a small country that had a troubled, really quarter century, and Ireland is different from the United States in a number of ways, but significantly different in that it was a nation before it was a state. The United States emerged as a nation and state together in its great founding documents. Long, long before Ireland became a state in the 1920s, it was a nation in the mind of so many of its people. And, you know, all the bad or good Irish songs of the 19th century are based on that, you know, nation once again. And that created the public poet, who I think was a mistake. I mean, I think it is the public poet that is likely to have to walk to the margins of the book and write "This is a lie." And, you know, if I had with me, which I fortunately have not and could never have, Porrick Pierce's poem, "The Fool," you know, you would be like Odysseus, you know, strapped to the mast as he went by the sirens. Everything in that poem is hypnotic. You know, since the wise man have not spoken, I speak, I'm only a fool. It is a public poem. It is without the complexity and the humanity that political artists came to have, I think, in Ireland. But there was a huge attraction to joining that collective. And I think Irish poetry really, of course, began when William Yeats stepped out of that demand that the Irish poet joined the public role and wrote the great 1916 poem with all its ambiguities and flaws, and, you know, wrote really great poems about the Civil War that show him in no good light, but showed him as a private human being. So I probably am on the side and that the political engagement of the poet has to have a private truth. If it doesn't, I think then it can become a public stance. And, you know, with great respect to the poets of certain political movements in Ireland, I don't think, with all their goodwill, that they have advanced the complexity of it. But of course I think people like Seamus Heaney and Derek Mahan, who took a hugely difficult role in trying to find in themselves the malaise that was outside themselves. And that really beautiful poem, Punishment, the Tall Man, where Seamus Heaney says, you know, out there in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. The huge moral ambiguity of these poets. I think that has been a saving grace in American poetry and in Irish poetry. And the political public poet, I think, is at risk.
It's start. I was thinking a lot and took some notes, just talking points really, thinking about this idea of the personal, which I think chimes with some of what you've said. I guess I think that's, the question really is not just the nature of politics, and maybe not even the nature of politics, but of the personal. The personal sort of eroded lately and almost become inverted, where you have privacy settings on social media. You know, we've become this kind of strange hybrid. And this erosion or confusion, I think, is a problem of power, which I take as the heart of the political. And the poets I admire, from Langston Hughes to Denise Levertov Berryman to Gwendolyn Brooks, wrestled with the nature of how such a political poem should look. For me, the political is not defined by proper names or by j'accuse or by any sort of certified stance. It is not defined by news, though it can contain that, especially the news that men, this is quoting or paraphrasing, William Carlos Williams, die miserably from not knowing every day. But the question remains how to capture not just the accused, but the accuser, to signal the self who is not entirely blameless and thus more believable. And to me, very much, that's what Heaney does, for instance. And I, have in my back pocket here, Strange Fruit by Heaney. And that moment where we happen to have at Emory, I'm a curator in the special collections there, curator of literary collections, and we have his drafts of Strange Fruit, the sonnet that he wrote that's also about the Vaud people. And I think that what's powerful to me is it used to be called Tete Coupé, and we have this moment where he crosses it out, and he's written Strange Fruit. And that transformation from, a headless or a head with cut off to Strange Fruit connects it so powerfully across this Atlantic to a shared or understood history of the troubles in Ireland with the troubles in the American South with lynching. What a powerful moment that must have been, I think. And speaks all the way back to Billie Holiday singing at Cafe Society, and I've written elsewhere about the silence that follows Billie Holiday's performances of Strange Fruit. Everyone who was there, which was an integrated audience, would not clap after she performed it, which she always performed at the end of her set. And I think about that fruitful silence a lot. And there's something in that of course the political poem seeks to combat, but that also I think is part of this understanding, the shared communal space, let's call it, for us to maybe listen a little harder. I think the political poem can change that silence. The silence before Strange Fruit is necessarily different than the silence after. I think a lot too about a poet like Lucille Clifton, whose collected poems I edited, and she has a poem that I think, if you'll let me read it short, captures some of the question. It's often referred to by its first few words, surely I am able. Surely I am able to write poems celebrating grass and how the blue in the sky can flow green or red, and the waters lean against the Chesapeake shore like a familiar. Poems about nature and landscape, surely. But whenever I begin, the trees wave their knotted branches, and why is there under that poem always an other poem? And that kind of hearing that other poem, the one I want to reach and maybe think about today. It's political not out of ability, but out of need. How do we talk about that necessity? The other thing I would add is just one thing any good poem should do is last, and this can be quite at odds sometimes, it feels, with the needs of a political poem, whose needs can be immediate, but all poems should convey, I feel, a sense of that immediacy. But is it that it tips over into urgency, and that this urgency doesn't last? And I think of Auden too, and him suppressing one's September 1939, which, in my opinion, is a mistake. I mean, I think it's a tremendous, powerful political poem that you see people reach for after 9/11, say, to understand the confusion. And I think that poem he was frustrated by because the end is, we must love each other or die, and then
One
he-
another or die.
yeah, love one another. Sorry, and he crossed that out later and said, "And die."
Yeah,
You know, and then he just trashed the whole thing, which he did once he crossed out war, because we know we have to die. You know, and it's the love that is the powerful part that I think he couldn't quite reconcile. Because that fascinates me, that story about Spain, which I heard in the library. We have a copy of a fair copy someone had typed up of Spain. Someone had presented to him, and he's written on it, "I have removed this poem from my collected poems, and thus will not sign it." He says, signing it. So I think that kind of that tension is there always, but Auden, picks one side.
I think that we're agreed on one thing, that the poets who write political poems that last are not because they're necessarily great political thinkers, but that what we need are, we need nonetheless poets enter in with their own point of view rather than becoming public poems. They are sometimes nonetheless compelled by public events. I think of the one line about Yeats, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." And that Yeats, while eschewing the position of the public poet, nonetheless felt hurt by events enough that he had to enter into the fray. He needed to enter into the fray.
Yeah, I think Auden felt, and he says in that poem, "Poetry makes nothing happen." I think he felt that in some way, which isn't true, I mean, he was a really beautiful poet, but he felt in some way he had made a corrupt negotiation with the idea of the public poet. And that, I think, was because in the 1930s he was made a representative poet.
That's right.
And that opens up what those particular dangers are.
Well, I think the danger for me, I mean, not for me personally, but for the public poet is that can they become a personal poet when they need to reach for it? There's poets I admire who I feel did become really trapped into this public role and couldn't reach and say, "I'm hurting, my sister's dead, my mother's dead, I can't write about that," because there's no place for me to say something that is not a policy kind of statement. Whereas I think what you're describing, this negotiation of the inner as a metaphor for the outer. And maybe for me, it's also, how do you capture that metaphor? Which is a question we wake up with as poets. But I think especially the poet who strives to be either a public poet or just a poet. I mean, for me, Heaney does that in the Bog People. They are apt metaphor for what he's trying to do.
I think the heart of some of the issue is an interesting clash between the ethical and the aesthetic, which comes up in political poetry. I always have in my mind some kind of ghost conflict that I haven't seen, but I hope to see, because I think it's the interesting conflict of one of the interesting conflict of our time. For hundreds and thousands of years, there have been nature poets who go out the door and make some kind of connection with the external universe and write a poem that is very often maybe solipsistic, maybe individual. But growing up beside that poet now is a ghost who is the environmental poet.
That's true.
And the environmental poet is going to say to them, just wait a moment, who cares what your inner feelings are? The earth you're admiring is being destroyed. And so the ethical obligations of the environmental poet will seek to weigh on the aesthetic interests of the nature poet. And that's an interesting conflict. And that's going to be somewhere down the road.
This is a very interesting point. You think of those poems, these spectacular nature poems by John Clear.
Sure.
And we now can see that those are extremely political
Right.
poems because they had a lot to do with enclosure.
And Lord Radstock said he must desist.
Exactly, because places where he used to walk in nature once freely, he now can no longer walk. And he feels that because this land has been privatized, he now feels a sense of trespass. And those personal poems of John Clear, so-called peasant poet, walking in nature freely, now no longer able to walk in nature freely, take on a tremendous political dimension because they challenge a class system.
Sure.
of private property.
Well, and Lucille, just to turn her again, she has a poem that starts, being property once myself.
Yeah.
I mean, wait,
Yeah. Yeah.
suddenly you're starting to think about
Yeah.
all these questions in a different way. And I think her early work has tremendous eco-poetics, where she's identifying with the bear, with the land, and saying the land is black. I mean, what a fascinating rewriting that she's engaged in there.
But if you look at it from, an ethical perspective, some of what the nature poet did, not Claire, looks self-indulgent or looks luxurious from the vantage point we take. And really the ethical vantage point is dangerous because it can edit, what we read.
But a lot of it's true that in the history of nature poetry, a lot of nature poetry is dominion over the land. And a lot of it is also a kind of middle-class leisure. And I see that critique of the pastoral poem. I've been really struck, I don't know if you have, but how many people have turned to that Langston Hughes poem. And looking at it again, I'm really struck by the fact that he says, America is not America to me. He doesn't say, America is not America to us. And yet, a lot of people have gone to see that and see themselves mirrored in that. It's after Ferguson, people see themselves mirrored in that Hughes poem. But Hughes would have been, I think, a public poet in the way you're talking about, in a way that he was not, if he had said America's not America to us.
Yes.
Because then he's speaking for the community. But he's not. The power of that witness is that he's speaking as an individual. And that resonates then with other people.
See, I would slightly disagree, Fred.
Good.
Because I think that he in part is, to me, his eye is always a we. And I don't mean just in that political poem, but in the blues poems, for instance. If there's a moment that I think the blues suggests, and that Whitman also suggested for Hughes, that when I say I mean we, and when I say us, I mean me, So there's the Negro speaks of rivers. It's the singular, all of the Negro, and then also this particular Negro speaks of rivers. And this Negro has seen, the sun go down, Abe Lincoln, he's seen the Congo, and he or she. And so there's this interesting kind of tension between this I that is expansive, but, I think the we slightly shifts.
Well, this is the Whitmanian tradition in America that's different than in other countries, where the I, we have Leaves of Grass as an epic.
Sure.
Other countries have epics that are actually epics where you don't actually speak for the self, you speak for the other. The epic hero in the Indian epic is not some weird individual, it's who speaks for the community. The American epic is the self who then stands in for the other. So I agree with you, that's a certain line in American.
So,
a certain line in American
Kevin,
poetry.
I hate to disagree with
Please.
you. Maybe this is Eddie's Townwood's Barrow, but anyway, I think the biggest event for the political poet was over the last 150 years, the decline of the first person plural. So that when Tennyson wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem which casts a very favorable light on a British military blunder. And when it was read, there is absolutely, certainly a consensus with that poem. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. And there was consensus on a great many of the poems could rest on the first person plural of we, the unspoken or spoken. And maybe Dover Beach starts to crack it up, but it's there. With the disintegration after the decline of organized religion in the First World War, the we no longer becomes tenable. And it is very difficult to get consensus with the we. It's very, when Denise Levertov writes Tenebrae on the Vietnam War, they are not listening. The we is a very fragile construct inside it. And therefore the I became heavily, heavily weighed on. And the political poet having to write out of an I and not a we is in a different era. And that's part of what Alden was saying in the margin.
Right. Yes, I think of Claude McKay, and Claude McKay's political sonnets, and him trying to write in against, with all alongside some of these questions. And there's the sort of a story that's probably apocryphal about soldiers carrying his poem in his pocket, and that Churchill recited it. Supposedly that's apocryphal. No one can find whether Churchill actually did recite Claude McKay.
This has been a very compelling issue for Eastern European poets.
Yes.
And I think it's because of the authority of communism and the termination of communism to get poets to speak as a we on behalf of certain values that certain poets, Miłosz, Herbert, Szymborska, Różewicz, all decided that they could not speak for the we, that it was the most political thing they could do, the most skeptical thing to do was to speak as an I. And I think that these probably have different resonance depending on what tradition you come out of. If you come out of a tradition where everyone speaks for the I, then probably some poet's going to come along and say, we really need to be offering some kind of communal voice. But if you come out of a society where poets are being demanded and pushed to speak for a we, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to do that and speak for the individual. I do think that there's a lot of political discourse in a society about all kinds of things, whatever happens. The question is, what does the poet provide in the political discourse? And I think it's a way of framing things from a somewhat eccentric, passionate engagement that gives it its power. And that the poet is emotionally present to a kind of event and a kind of register of it. And that certain poets are at times pressured into speaking publicly. I wanted to look up something that Adrienne Rich had said because she seemed to be one of the most explicitly political poets of our time. That there was absolutely no doubt in her mind about the need of speaking on behalf of a cause. But then when I looked up what she actually said, I thought it was extremely subtle about the role of the political poet. And here's a little quote that she wrote. No true political poetry can be written with propaganda as an aim, to persuade others out there of some atrocity or injustice. Hence the failure as poetry of so much anti-Vietnam poetry of the 60s. As poetry, it can only come from the poet's need to identify her relationship to atrocities and injustice, the sources of her pain, fear, and anger, the meaning of her resistance. Now that's extremely powerful because it comes from such an explicitly political poet. But it's her recognition that if it's going to work as poetry, then it has to be personal. It has to come out of her own experience. And she identifies one of the weird truths about the poetry of Vietnam. That there was and this was important to me because it was when I was first coming up as a poet. Almost all the poets I admire were against the war and were writing anti-war poems. It turns out that very, very few of those poems have survived. They have a historical interest. The poems that have come out of that war that have been crucial were poems by vets who came back and wrote poems out of their own experience. And you think of the poems of Yusuf Komunyakaa and Bruce Weigel and others who have written poems based on their own experience. Now I'm not saying that, I think it was important that Robert Lowell and Robert Bly and Galway Kinnell and Denise Levertov and Rich all wrote poems against the Vietnam War. It turns out that very few of those poems will outlast their moment. And this is one of the crucial questions that we wish we had the answer for this one. How do you write a political poem that will survive the circumstances of the writing of it? Because most political poems enter into an issue, and then when the issue changes, the poems die. So what is it about poems that survive that moment that we still read a political poem by Edmund Spencer now? What is that? Or we still read Wordsworth's sonnet that you and I both admire so much? Why is it long after the political figures aren't relevant anymore to our moment, those political poems are?
Well, I think the poetry of World War I provides a really interesting light on this question. I think there's such a breadth of really interesting war poets then, and many poets writing who went to the front as ambulance drivers. I mean, almost all of that generation, the lost generation, did. And I'm currently obsessed with this woman poet, Gladys Cromwell, who writes from the front and writes about war, but is not well read. But I also think about, I'm still stuck on the American eye, because I think there's also a question of masking and doubleness. And for me, the political poem requires the kind of doubleness of immediacy, but also immortality. And you have to have that double voice. And someone like Neruda, I think, does this by being personal and then political and then intermixing the two and having this breadth as well as breadth. And I feel like, is that possible in, English poetics?
I think the most controversial part for a lot of people in those more recent generations is in what Eddie read about what Adrienne Rich said. It's because it's partly a definition of the responsibility of the book.
Right.
And that's where the fissure opens. That's where the fault line is. A lot of poets do not see that they have a responsibility to any public event. And I think that was particularly so over the last 30 years. People didn't. The Northern Irish poets, to me, had a very interesting figuration in the way that during the 60s, they were younger poets. I think they were very interested in European writing, and they were interested in British and American poetry. They would have foreseen a future for themselves in which they were fairly broad-based poets. Once the Troubles happened, they were conscripted poets. They didn't really feel they had a choice. Even Derek Mann, who went and lived in London, they didn't really feel they could walk away as poets. And the idea of the conscripted poet is often the political poet. I mean, when we think of certain poets, and that's what Auden didn't like. He felt they had tried to conscript in the anti-fascist decade in England, and he resented that. And the idea of the conscription of the political poet is interesting.
Well, and I think a poet of that time, a little bit earlier, Robert Lowell from the Union Dead, to me is a perfect example of a political poem because it's, ambiguous, it's personal, it's about his savage servility as well as him looking at the TV and watching those black faces, I think is so powerful. And about what he can't reach as much as what he knows in his heart. And, I don't know that.
Part of Lowell's poem is a response to his, Alan Tate was his teacher, and Alan Tate's poem, Ode to the Confederate Dead, is not so moving to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Well, it's one of his only moving poems, but maybe not.
the emotion wasn't his greatest strength.
Yeah.
But it was his wasteland. But I mean, Lowell felt he had some purchase on history.
I think there are things that weigh on the issue of that. I mentioned this earlier, and it certainly weighs on me. I don't think we have so much of moral responsibilities as poetry. That's a very contentious area as poets. I am sure we have a moral responsibility as readers of poetry. And, it weighs with me with great interest, and I'm troubled by an event that happened in the middle of the 2000 decade in Afghanistan that has come through by a number of Iranian American poets and a number of people who've spoken to me about it. Afghanistan has, of course, a great tradition in a dialect of Farsi, which is Dara. And there was a young woman who turns up in the New York Times in 2001. And after the United States has entered Afghanistan, she belongs to this thing called the Sewing Circles of Herat, where a professor was bringing in women apparently to sew, but they were actually reading literature. Nani Anjuman turns up at the New York Times at 20, and she's written a lot of poetry, and she says, I'm going to try to put off getting married because, I want to be a poet. She's in Herat, one of the most literary cities of Afghanistan on the Silk Road, great shrine to Jami, the Sufi poet there. She does go to university, and she brings out a book called Gul-e-Dodi, which his translation is Dark Red Flower. And the book is looked at with interest by poets, and New York Times identifies that in 2005. And she does get married. She marries a lecturer in the English department, I should say the English department, in the literature department of Afghanistan's university in Haran. And she has a little boy, and at 25, she is killed by her husband and his mother. And the New York Times notes the death. It is an honor killing. And they are arrested, but not brought to trial, as is the case, unfortunately, in some of those killings. And so the family make it clear that they had been profoundly shamed. And this goes exactly back to what Eddie said at the beginning. I think when we talk about the political poet, many people, I certainly when I wrote in Ireland, I might have, when I was 25, felt it was a very conservative and chauvinist country. I never for a moment had a moment of fear in that country. I never thought I wouldn't publish. I never thought. I think it is a moral responsibility to listen to the voices that rise out of historical contention and that need us to listen. Otherwise, we won't see the other side of the political poet, who are people profoundly at risk from the exercise of the political in poetry. And that's the other side of the story.
Can I just say, you write about this very well in an essay in the new issue of American Poetry Review. And that you bring forward the idea, which was a new idea to me, of the moral responsibility of the reader, not just of the writer.
The trouble is, when we translate, what interests me most is when you speak about poets, as you know so well, Eddie, and the Polish poets. But sometimes when we translate the poem, we cannot translate the poet. I don't think you can translate Anjuman easily. She wrote in this dialect of Farsi. She was a young woman. She wrote the ghazal. She had a very strong traditional relationship with the canonical Farsi poets. So I don't really know who she was. She's been well translated. But I certainly want to read her. And if I didn't read her, I would think my idea of the political poet was somehow incomplete. And I think we have at least a responsibility, and partly what you were saying, Kevin, and some of the, Seamus changing the title, to reach to the other reality.
Did you bring a poem by someone else that we could read, or do you want to read one of your own
I
poems?
read just one of my own.
Okay. Would you?
Yes. This really goes back to, it does go back to some of this. If it's not a political poem, it is certainly a poem in which I wanted to address at least one or two of these issues. It seems to me that some of what the public poet writes about are public events. Some of the best political poems that have been written are about invisible events. And the hidden lives, the lives that are really not clear. And in Ireland, there was a big difference between the past and history. The history is the official version, and a lot of people didn't live in the official version. A lot of lives are not lived in the official version. In 1900, there was a book called Mashkel Fame, which means my story. It was written by a man who was then a parish priest. And he describes these two young people. He heard his mother, when he was a little boy, mention in the 1847 famine, a young couple who left the workhouse on a very bitter night, and they walked back to their cabin, and they were found dead in the morning. They were weakened by the famine and by the fever. But he had tried to take her feet and hold them against his chest as she died, and that is in Mashkel Fame. And those people appear for 4 or 5 sentences and are gone forever, and we don't know who they are, and they're not really recorded in the official version. It's called Quarantine. I was partly to reproach the forms of poetry itself that don't always record these things. Quarantine. In the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking, they were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history, but her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heap of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847. Also, what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved.
So, it's hard for me to pick. I was thinking of reading from a book called For the Confederate Dead, which was a book I was very nervous about publishing, thinking I'd get lots of Confederate fan mail, or I don't know which would be worse. But in a way, I was talking back to that. But what I'm working on now, the manuscript I'm finishing, takes as one of its center parts the fact that Linda Brown of Brown v. Board was the organist and pianist in my church growing up in Topeka, Kansas. So as I said before, you couldn't ignore history. I was right there singing to you. So this new work sort of goes and considers that with that poem and another poem about Emmett Till rather long. So I think I'll read a poem that's from another sequence which called Repast, which is about a waiter in Mississippi, a true story, named Booker Wright, who appeared on an NBC TV show where he gave the menu of this fancy restaurant in Greenwood, Mississippi, and then he did a kind of pantomime where he enacted, just described really what some of his customers said to him, and some of it was quite shocking, bless you, not, I suppose, because of what he said, but the fact that he was honest about it. And for that, he was beaten probably by a local cop and put in the hospital. And so thinking about him as kind of, a civil rights activist, just being a waiter, being an activist. And so he also owned his own juke joint. And I was trying to write about what it meant to be in this juke joint as opposed to being a waiter, though I also write about that. So I think I'll read that poem. It's called Booker's Place. Booker's Place. It's the haze that hurts, sometimes far worse than when the sun spits its rays all over your face. Them days you brown and redden, the work can be like to kill you. So a man need a place to go inside his head and walk around and rest. There's a juke joint of the soul, somewhere you can have yourself something cold or brown burning water. We used to get in ice fresh, cut from giant blocks, sawdust, clean glasses, and good food. I kept the bar sparkling, shiny as the teeth of the couples on calendars behind me, staring into each other's eyes. Budweiser in cans, knee-high, drink Coca-Cola high up. This was my place, a green room, a somewhere you could twist, maybe spin a partner on the dance floor, or just set a spell and tap your foot, mine, taking it all in. We never let anyone carry on too long and made sure they carried themselves home safe beside the tracks that also kept their crosses clanging. That train, red, and I, then blue, bearing down on you.
In the 1980s and the early 1990s, I was obsessed with stories about the disappeared in Argentina. But I could not think about what purchase I could have as a poet, or how I could enter into this story, which was not mine, and where I would enter in this. But I thought about it for a long time. And then I was reading one of those, Amnesty International used to put out these books which were torture by the decade and going around the world. I didn't know at that time that the United States would one day enter into this, much to my shame and to our shame. But in any case, I was reading about torture around the globe in Amnesty International's guide, and I was really struck by the way the torturers used language and the way they took ordinary language and used it to describe tortured people. And suddenly I felt as a poet I had a claim on it. And so I wrote a poem in which every one of the phrases is a kind of torture in the poem. It's called A Short Lexicon of Torture in the 80s. That's not a man in pain, but a Brazilian phone. It won't be making any outgoing calls. That's not a woman sprawling on the floor, but an old-fashioned dance, like the tango. Pull up a chair with a knotted rope. Let's have a tea party with toast and hors d'oeuvres. Let's take a seat on the parrot's perch. Let's rock to the Motorola with headphones. Do you want to bathe in the porcelain tub? Do you want to sing to the little hare? Let's stroll over to the guest room. Let's take a bus ride to the San Juanica Bridge. Forget the ovens and smokestacks. Forge the rack and screw, the tiger's cage. We're celebrating a birthday party in your honor. We're lighting candles on your favorite cake. We're taking you to a parade on a sandy beach. You're going down in a submarine. Do you have any questions or comments or arguments? Complaints you can save and give to Kim later. If you have any questions, we're delighted to talk to you about anything related to politics and poetry.
I've been a political person like practically all my life, and I was very active in the feminist movement in Boston, and now I'm making a film called What Makes Me White, because I'm thinking a lot about race in the United States. And I have, in working on poems, there's like two things. One is that I just feel like if you're going to be a poet, you have to be disobedient to whatever rules you've been following as a political person. I feel like the work that I've done is like, I don't know if feminists I worked with in the 70s and 80s would approve or not. I just was like, I have to not care about anything like that. So coming along with it, I'm making this film, but I have almost no poems about race. I feel like I can speak in prose about whiteness, but I can't yet speak in poetry about it because I have the standard that you all talked about, which is I'm not gonna, I want it to be that kind of authentic, deep speech, and I can't, it isn't there yet. So I want to thank you for everything that you guys have said. It's been really good. It's good for me to hear it and a joy to hear your work. I just wanted to comment the different ways that this is a struggle for me.
I don't know if you could hear what she was saying. She was saying something extremely interesting, which is that, I'm just paraphrasing, but that she's been a political person her entire life, but as a poet, she feels that she needs to not be obedient to that political person or the cause that she served, and that the voice of poetry must come from somewhere else. Was that a fair paraphrase of the first part of your comment?
Yeah, but I feel like my poems are extremely feminist, but in a completely different way.
Well, I think that's smart. I mean, it just seems to
It's
me
just that the voice of my poetry really comes out of the feminist movement. I can feel it, you know, I can just totally feel it. Maybe there's just not enough of a whiteness movement yet or something, you know, I don't have language, you know.
now she's saying how difficult it is. She's making
To
a
be
film,
white.
but how difficult it's so hard to be white. But it's so, it's so hard to write poems. It's so hard to write poems.
Well, Sharon Olds has a great poem that I've heard her read a number of times recently called Ode to My Whiteness, you know, which as soon as she says that, people start to laugh. And I think it's because it's something that is undersaid. And what she's doing in the poem is this interesting dance with it that also is dancing with Evie Shockley's work quite explicitly, who wrote a book called The New Black. And so I think there's a real dialogue that has to happen, both across questions of race, but also within us all about, you know, ethics and morals and aesthetics. And I don't think there's one answer, as you can see from what we're saying, but I'm more interested in that moral question and the moral question of the reader than the ethical nature. I mean, ethics can get real tough for me when you're sitting down to write. You have to kind of get all your editors out of there when you're trying to write anyway. And maybe that's one. And then, you know, nothing more shocking than you write something you don't really agree with, but it sounds good. And you have to give yourself at least that freedom, I think. And I think Auden can make anything sound good. And so for him, there was this kind of constant questioning of, you know, just because that sounds good, is that true? Is that true? And then sometimes, you know, it sounds better than it's true. Even poetry makes nothing happen, which is, I think, still ambiguous. But, you know.
In every poetry, oh, sorry.
No, I go ahead.
I was just saying, in every poetry, there is a kind of debate going on about how much the poet should put himself or herself to the wheel of the cause, and how much the poet should write out of his or her own experience. The causes, and this is related to, I think, what you're saying, the causes want you to put, as a poet, to speak in some kind of politically correct way for the causes. But the poet is more subversive there. In Yiddish poetry, for example, there were the sweatshop poets in the early part of the century. They were all labor poets, extremely political. They used to say these are poems of the shirt worker by one who made the shirt. But these poems have almost no lasting value. They're only interesting in the history of labor. There was another group of poets called the Young Ones who rebelled against the sweatshop poets. They were aesthetes. They said Yiddish poetry has to be free. And then you can see this debate right now going on in Chicano poetry very intensely, because most Chicano poetry is extremely social. There's a tremendous pressure on Chicano poets because of the tremendous injustices against Chicano people to, you know, put your queer shoulder to the wheel and fight for the cause. And there's kind of debate within this poetry about how much it should be speaking about social and political issues, and how much the poet is free to write what she wants or what he wants.
And I was very interested in what you said. I'm not going to take up the issue of feminism, but I think it's always very interesting, and I'm honored to be a feminist. I'm not a feminist poet. If I had been a Marxist, I wouldn't be a Marxist poet. And I think, you know, that the certainties end on the threshold of the poem. But, you know, it's very interesting in that, speaking about who approves of what, you know, William Yeats, who was looked at with great suspicion anyway in Ireland, he was Anglo-Irish, and his politics turned out to be very peculiar, and had profound admiration for Mussolini's education minister. You know, he was in a minority, I think, but anyway. But
He wrote those marching songs.
oh, listen. Anyway, but that was later. But in the first decade, when the national movement was beginning, he was involved with the Abbey Theatre, and he was looked at with great suspicion by the nationalists. And poor John Millington Synge, who was sick at the time, wrote The Playboy of the Western World. It's a beautiful play about the fantasies of the Irish people and their self-glorification and violence, not something any nationalist wanted to hear. The nationalists came down for the first night of that and broke up every single one of the first 5 rows of the seats of the Abbey Theatre. And William Yeats called in the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police of the oppressor against those people. Had he not done that, it was the single largest act of political courage in that decade. Had he not done that, there would be no Irish revival. We would all be writing War and Pierce as the fool. And you know, the courage to go against the orthodoxy. And you know, William Yeats stood by that, and you know, when they rioted again, you know, at Sean O'Casey's play, of course, you know, he went out to that audience and said, you know, you have disgraced yourselves again. And basically, these very unreliable agendas that require the artist to respond on ethical issues, I think are almost all wrong, all the time. And, you know, poor Seamus, God rest him, describes in this really beautiful book, Stepping Stones, of getting on the Enterprise train, which ran from Dublin to Belfast, you know, 3 times a day. When it went over the Dundalk border, the Republican movement usually boarded the train, and one of them boarded the train and sat down opposite Seamus and said, when are you going to do something for us? And, you know, and Seamus records it, you know, what he didn't do was something for them, you know, and if he had, he would have lost that wonderful voice he had. So to me, you know, that particular contest against the ethical prescriptions has a good history in a lot of poetry.
But can I add one more thing? I'm really sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but just that at the same time, daring to speak, for me, came from the feminist movement.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't be specifically saying anything if it weren't for the feminist movement.
I totally respect and I understand that, and you know, I was in the feminist movement in Ireland. I'll finish this comment now. When women couldn't sit on juries, and anyway, the long list of distinguished Irish laws. And I remember going home, I was 22 years of age, I said to my father, who after all was a civil servant, you know, why can women not sit on juries? My mother was there, who was highly progressive. And my father said to me, why would women want to sit on a jury? My mother said, don't worry. She said, I was once, you know, out at dinner and someone said to me, women are too beautiful to vote. And so, you know, I mean, extraordinary, you know, the feminist movement in Ireland was hugely important, and I'm honored to have been anywhere next to near them. I just don't think the imagination is an ethical construct. That's just the personal view.
This is a really very stimulating conversation. I'm getting so much out of this. I really appreciate you all presenting. I wonder if it would be useful to think about the body of the poet. And just to put in here an idea that it's hard to write a good poem. And then if you add on that, it's hard to write a good political poem. Or add on that, it's hard to write a good pastoral. Is there something to be said about how the poet is built? Some poets are built. Adrienne Rich may have been built since she was 6 to write her poems because of her particular antenna. And other poets who are wonderful poets aren't built with the same engine of quote-unquote political poets.
But I think Adrienne Rich could have easily just written the poems that made her quite known, you know, for the Young Poets Prize. You know, she could, and I think she talks about that, about how she had to kind of change, I think, and the transformation to me is as interesting as the product of the transformation. I think Baraka is a fascinating figure for that way. Equally, you know, along the way, different paths, different troubles and questions, but also a poet of transformation and change. Merwin's The Lice, a fantastic book, partially because it's metaphoric, I think. And so I'm interested in these poets of transformation. I guess I would hesitate to say that they were born that way and that they would have always said that, because we might forget what effort it takes to change in public, which is essentially what many of them did, and many of them were quite famous, you know, and it's sort of like your question of the public poet, you know, and I think Neruda did it well in terms of he could write a book of love poems and then write a political, not a tract, but a book.
I mean, I think your point is a good one, which is that it's in the wheelhouse of certain poets to write certain kinds of poems, and they can't write other kinds of poems, even if they try. But I think the thing that we quarrel with is that you were born that way, and that this is the only thing you could do, because a poet like Adrienne Rich could have gone on being a kind of skillful, Auden-esque poet, the way early Merwin was in his first 4 books, where he was writing as if the industrial world didn't exist in his first 4 books. And starting with The Moving Target and The Lice, he begins to change, partially under the pressure of what's happening, the injustices of the 60s and the nuclear movement. So the other thing I guess I should add here is that certain forms or modes do invite poets to address certain things. Earlier we were talking about odes. And the ode is by its very nature a poem towards a public event of a certain occasion. And so the ode, no matter what it doesn't have a particular form like the sonnet or the villanelle, but it does call poets to do certain things. Now, there are a lot of bad odes. And a lot of the great odes subvert the traditions of the ode.
Right.
Just like a lot of great elegies subvert the decorum of the elegy. But nonetheless, you enter into an ode, you do enter into a poem on a public occasion, and it does have a history. And when a Milton comes along, and he can write poems about Cromwell that turn out to be of great interest to us today still. But yes, the wheelhouse of certain poets will not necessarily have particular political strengths. Because it's hard to write poetry at all, and to write good poetry is difficult.
But it is a very interesting question, and I think it brings up, there is maybe a political poet, and maybe from early on, as Eddie says, it's in the wheelhouse. She's also a political reader, and so what I think Eddie said at the beginning, that the Hermetic poems of Dickinson now look profoundly political, as they didn't at the time. And so the rereading, the political rereading, makes us see that poets as you think DNA. I mean, I do think Rich she has this beautiful essay called Split at the Root, where her father, a distinguished and somewhat prescriptive man, was someone she wrote to please. And somewhere she broke with that. And I don't think she was inherently political. I think it was that break that radicalized her. She is a poet of radicalization even more than politics. I mean, she was radicalized in the 60s, and partly by her own confrontation with the need to change from decorum, which she had stood by. And I, of course, think it was a great transformation. She's a great voice. But that radicalization is very, very interesting.
A great example, the word hermetic was what reminded me of a great example of this is the Italian poet Eugenio Montale, who's a really great poet. He spoke in a way, his poems in his first book, The Storm, etc., The Storm and other things, he wrote poems that were against the bombastic poems of Italy entering into the war in the 30s. They're hermetic, they're cryptic, they're difficult, but they turn out to be great political poems of resistance at the time. And he's got the skills of a hermetic poet, but they're the way a hermetic poet approaches certain public events that are happening, which is sometimes metaphorical. We're running out of time. So.
Thank you for this. I was at an event a few years ago in London called the Poetry Congress, which was associated with the Olympics, where they got allegedly a poet from every country in the world, and some non-recognised countries, either online or in the South Bank to read. And it was an amazing experience. One of the things that was very noticeable was a dramatic difference between the level of admissible politics, if you like, in the poetic practice of people from different places. So in one sense, there was a division between what we call the developed world and the developing world. So there was a very strong politics that was very forward in the poetics of people from Africa, and also lots of Southeast Asian poets. There was an amazing South Korean poet, it was extraordinarily political, moving. It was very upfront in the poetics. But there was also a bit of a division between, that I've noticed more broadly, between British poetry and American poetry and Canadian poetry too. Between I think having moved here about 2 years ago, there's a very strong sense to me, reading through the magazines and reading sort of, just the New Yorker and things like that politics is much more upfront in poetry here than it is in Britain. In Britain, I feel like there obviously is some, but it really has that sort of undercurrent rather than a kind of upfront issue related thing or something like that. And none of these poets are party political, but they are, there's a difference. And I wonder what that is, especially in the transatlantic context. I think in the developing world, because obviously politics is about to kill you.
I don't want to say anything about Britain versus the United States. Maybe you
Absolutely
should say
never.
something. But I will say that
country.
when you go around the world, poets from small countries have a different sense of responsibility toward what happens in their country than poets from larger countries often do. Not just politics. There's a terrific book of essays by Adam Zagievsky called Solidarity, Solitude, or Solitude, Solidarity, I think it is. And it's about the tug, or the battle, between part of you that wants to write about aesthetics, part of you that wants to write about beauty, part of you that wants to write about nature. And part of you can't ignore the fact that your country's under siege and that things are happening. And there's a kind of battle within the poet. The Polish poets are very smart about this issue between the pull towards something private and metaphysical, the concerns of, love, beauty, and the falling seasons, versus the Nazis and then the communists have taken over your country. And you can't ignore that fact that you're in an occupied country. And I think writers in small countries, not just poets, but writers in general, feel this tug towards what's happening nationally very powerfully. In Ireland, this is certainly the case.
I think in Britain, which of course had such an extraordinary and great and defining poetry, in some senses became, I think, probably around the Second World War, a post-imperial country. And the result of that in some ways was these great pessimistic lyric of people like Larkin. And I think, for Larkin to define that lyric, he depoliticized it in certain ways, though of course he has beautiful poetry. And there, Auden's traumatic leaving of England, his abandonment of that role, I would think you would know much better, would have to have left a mark of some kind about the restraint and the reticence. I mean, there are beautiful poets in England, Alice Oswald and John Burnside, and I read them. But I do know what you mean, that there is a sort of private speech there.
Well, also in Larkin, there's a strong politics of nostalgia.
Yes.
For some, those were the days.
Absolutely.
Those when England was England. We were in charge.
I think also, just thinking about what you were saying, there's that tension between, the public and the metaphysical you're saying and the political say. But I think the smart political poet writes about that tension.
Yeah.
And writes exactly in that. And sometimes it's a tension played out in form, sometimes it's a tension played out in rhetoric, but it's always played out. And for me, the best poets do that in the work that's seemingly not political, but especially in their political work, there's always that pull. And I think that's really important to maintain and mention.
He wasn't the only person. I think, Elizabeth Bishop hugely admired Philip Larkin and left that note about it. I think John Ashbery did as well. And maybe that kind of, I know it was a nostalgia for England, but the self in his work is an abandoned and desolate self, which itself is a political text in the post-imperial. I'm a huge admirer of Philip Larkin. He was anti-Irish, anti-women. I think I probably have stopped. I probably stopped.
Anti-Semitic. Let's
views,
not
yes.
throw that one down too.
But leaving all that aside, he is a beautiful, endlessly renewable poet. So I think it also suggests that maybe there comes a moment not to look at poets' politics, and just look at poets.
So, thank you everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you.
be a book signing now. Thank you so much.